Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured, but the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the topics that keeps coming up over and over again in St. Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will are the virtues, and to a lesser extent the vices. By contrast, if you're going to talk about virtues, you really necessarily end up talking about their opposites, the vices. And Augustine is not trying to give us an entire theory of the virtues in this work. It's kind of a tangential topic that he keeps coming back to. It is important. It does help you understand what he's talking about, particularly in terms of the will and how the will orients itself, as we'll see in just a moment. One thing that's really important to point out is he is not talking about all of the virtues, and he's putting it in a somewhat theological framework, but he's not talking about what we call the theological virtues, so faith, hope, charity. If we have the sort of traditional 7 virtues kind of schema. Instead, he's talking about these cardinal virtues that we first see talked about in an organized, systematic way by Plato in the Republic, and then sort of reconsidered by Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't have a schema of the cardinal virtues the way that Plato did, and these 3 right here end up being moral virtues. This one, prudence or wisdom, ends up being an intellectual virtue, is closely tied with moral virtue. Then the Stoics take this up, and other people. By the time that Augustine is writing about this is a pretty well-established schema of the virtues. And what are the virtues? Well, they are traits that represent perfections of character, ideals, you might say, things that we can strive for, ways in which a human being is good, not only good for other people, but good for themselves and good in their relationship with other people, and if you put it in a theological framework, in relation to God as well. So, these are the cardinal virtues that he's going to talk about, and what we're going to talk about here, what we're going to look at here, is what Augustine has to say about the specifics of these virtues, and where they actually are, what they actually are. His view on them is a little bit different than a lot of other people that we might associate with him. And then we're going to look at how the virtues are connected with the will and with reason. And we're going to sort of approach this in all these different topics tied in together. I'm going to jump around a little bit in the work itself. Some of the stuff is in book 1, and then he lets it lay for a while, and then he takes it up again in book 2, and then book 3. So we're gonna jump around a little bit, but not all that much. So let's start with thinking about these virtues in general. So Augustine in book 1, the central question there is, who's responsible for bad things, for evil, bad actions in particular. And his answer is, well, it's human beings. God, didn't make them do anything evil. It's they choose willingly to do the wrong things. It's not in a vacuum. It's not as if they just walk along and say, I think I'd like to do something awful. Instead, they allow their passions, their desires to call the shots, you might say. And the will sort of wavers in between reason, and for Augustine, reason generally doesn't go bad, right? Or the passions and desires. And even the passions and desires in themselves are not something bad, but they can lead us to do inordinate things. They can lead us to value the wrong things too highly and the right things too lowly. So the will is generally better off listening to reason than to the passions and desires, but the will gets to choose between these. So, where do the virtues come in with this? Well, the virtues are particular ways in which our will gets formed. There, you might say, patterns after which the will can get formed, model itself, take on determinate shapes over time. And they're tied in with knowledge, they're tied in with understanding, with wisdom, with reason. They're also tied in with the structure of the will and, in some cases, what the will has to do in relation to passions or desires. So let's see what Augustine actually has to tell us about these. There's a passage in Book 1 where he and his student Evodius are going back and forth, and he asks Evodius, consider whether prudence seems to you to consist in the knowledge of what to seek and what to avoid. So that's a pretty standard definition of prudence. A form of knowledge, not in the sense of information that's on some sort of book where you can just read it off of a list. Oh, here's what I ought to do, here's what I ought to avoid. But embodied, habitually developed knowledge that you've actually made your own, which you can also apply to your own case and to those of others. So Evodius says, yeah, I think that's the case. I think it is knowledge of what to seek and what to avoid. Fortitude is not fortitude or courage, that state of the soul in which we despise all misfortunes and the loss of things not resting in our power. So this is also a kind of knowledge. This is a fairly Platonic, although Aristotle also thinks that courage does seem to involve some sort of knowledge of what ought to be feared and what ought not to be feared, what ought to be despised instead. So Augustine puts it in terms of loss of things not residing in our power, which is in some ways closer to the Stoics, who explicitly focused on that sort of thing. In this case, of course, it's going to be tied in with his conception of God, eternal goods, the eternal law, the virtues, having a good will, all those sorts of things. So fortitude is a virtue that lets us resist getting tied in with things that really are not in our power to maintain, to control. It keeps us from valuing too highly uncertain goods. Temperance. Temperance, he says, do you agree that temperance is that state of soul which controls and checks desire in regard to those things which it is shameful to desire? So notice, it's not that temperance controls all desire whatsoever. Augustine is not a prude. He's a guy who actually understands sins of the flesh quite well. He actually at one point says, Lord, give me continence, but not yet. Help me out, with these sins of the flesh, that is pursuing things that are, we have inordinate desires for in inordinate ways, but not quite yet. So Augustine really understood this stuff well. He is not saying temperance is sort of like turning off the body altogether. Instead, it's a virtue because it applies to the right things. It applies to, for example, you shouldn't be going around having sex with anybody who presents themselves. That's going to get you in trouble. You shouldn't go around eating everything or even tasting everything. You shouldn't be drinking all the time, or there's some things, I suppose, that you probably shouldn't even do once. So Augustine is saying temperance is in fact this virtue that helps us to control and check desire in regard to these things which is shameful to desire. And then justice. What is justice? It's the virtue by which each man is given his due. Each person is given what they deserve. Again, fairly typical understandings of these virtues. Augustine is not breaking a lot of new ground with these. Now, Augustine is asking about the person who has the good will. And he says, the man who has a good will love this alone, his most precious possession, will delight in this and make it his joy and pleasure. There's a reflexivity, and I talk about this in some of the other videos, the course videos that I've done, to the will, where the good will is itself something good that has to be valued above just the satisfaction of the desires. The good will is going to be a will that's in line with reason, But the goodwill is something that in reason can tell the goodwill, hey, you ought to hold on to yourself, you ought to value yourself this way. But only the will can actually make that choice, can actually sort things out in that way, practically, in the way one's life is lived. So, how do the virtues figure into this? That's where it gets particularly interesting. He says, the man who has a good will love this alone, will delight in this, make it joy in his pleasure, realizing fully its value, and that he cannot be robbed of it against his will. The only way in which you can lose the goodwill is by choosing to value something else higher. You know, some say honor or wealth or sexual satisfaction or revenge or whatever. So he says, surely we cannot doubt that he will be opposed to all that conflicts with this one good. And Avodia says, yeah, he's going to be opposed to it. So, how do the virtues come in? Can we suppose such a man is not endowed with prudence? Prudence is what, in fact, allows us to see that the good will, in determinate circumstances, when we're actually being tempted, when we're inclined to make when we're inclined to make an exception for ourselves and say, well, usually it's wrong to seek revenge, but I'm going to do it in this case, and it's okay for me in this case. Well, that means giving up the goodwill, and prudence would counsel against that. So prudence, he says, sees that this good should be sought for and everything avoided which conflicts with it. Prudence helps us to hold on to the goodwill by knowing indeterminate circumstances, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, what we ought to do and what choices we ought to make, even if we don't really feel like making them. So he says, what about fortitude? Why should we not grant him fortitude? He cannot love and value highly all these things not under our control, honor, wealth, even to a certain extent relationships, insofar as we turn them into a kind of idol and say that we have to have those. A certain way of viewing ourselves can fit in with that. Satisfaction of our bodily desires, the desire to dominate other people, all these sorts of things are not actually under our control, and they're not goods that we can not be deprived of against our will. So we ought to rank those kind of low. And he says they're loved through an evil will, and he's bound to resist an evil will as the enemy of his most precious good. If you've got a good will, and part of that goodwill means you want to hold on to that goodwill, when it comes down to choosing some lesser good and choosing to maintain your goodwill, then fortitude is part of what helps you despise those other goods. That doesn't mean saying that they're not good. It just means putting them in the proper perspective. So, what about temperance? Well, temperance checks passion. He says, what is so opposed to a good will as passion? So the man who loves his good will resists his passion by every means and fights against them. As a matter of fact, if you're smart about this sort of thing, and Augustine, again, is very smart about these sort of things, you'll realize that you're almost never going to be totally free of passions that want you to do more for them, to satisfy them than you ought to, than is ordinate, than is within proper bounds. And so you actually need temperance to help you out, to sort these matters through when you're in moments of temptation. So temperance is needed. And then finally, justice. It says, there remains justice. I certainly do not see how such a man can lack this. If he possesses and loves to possess a good will and resists, as I have said, what is opposed to it, he cannot wish evil to anyone. It follows he harms no one. And this can only be the case if he gives to everyone his due. So we start, with this notion of justice as giving everybody their due. And Augustine is interpreting this in a somewhat more expanded way so that the person who's just is not actually going to harm anyone. And you might say, well, what about punishment or, fighting under orders or stuff like that? Augustine would say harm is being done in one sense, but also not being done in another sense. Punishment is actually to improve the person who's being punished. And, nobody likes it, but that's the way that it works. coming back to this with justice. So if you actually have a good will, a will that not only is directed the right way, but wants to be directed the right way, and sees that as a good, then that is going to entail having justice. Justice is going to consolidate the goodwill in relation to other people. So, like with temperance, it's in relation to the passions that you feel for other things. Justice, it's going to be in relation to other people and your relationships with them and your dealings with them. And even perhaps, if you're a judge, their relationships with each other or their dealings with each other, or this kind of society that you live in. So like he says, you remember, I think you agreed when I said this was the concern of justice, giving everyone their due. Avodia says, yes, I accepted your account of the four virtues just now and agree that all of them are present in the man who values highly and loves his goodwill. So this is really a central concept for Augustine, the goodwill. The person who really exemplifies this, and keep in mind, he's talking about sort of an ideal here. He's not talking about every single person who's sort of on their way towards this ideal. The person who has this ideal of, the completely goodwill is going to have all of these virtues fully developed. And you might say, well, which came first, the virtues or the goodwill? Kind of go together. There's a dialectical relationship between them. If you actually have that goodwill, then you're going to want to cultivate these virtues. And while you're cultivating these virtues, these are ways of taking your will, which is not completely good at one point, and trying to sort of fix it up in process. So that's something from Book 1. Now I want to go on to Book 2. In Book 2, Augustine tells us a little bit more about where these virtues actually come from. And a lot of people look at virtues as character traits, right? And Augustine thinks that they're character traits. So they tend to think of them as having their existence in the person themselves. And Augustine would say, yeah, that's true. And where specifically, well, in particular, in the will, right? So these cardinal virtues are things that are shaping the will in its battle with passion or desire, its attempt to follow reason. But that's not the whole story. Where are these virtues actually coming from? So Augustine says this in Book 2. He says, he's talking about how we gain knowledge about things. He says, it's enough that you see as I do and admit to be quite certain that those principles and illuminations, so to speak, in which the virtues appear. So principles and illuminations. Illumination means, shedding light, gaining insight. The virtues are not things that are just in us. They're ways in which we actually participate in something greater than us. So, what do we have over here? Eternal goods, God, eternal law, truth, wisdom, and the virtues. The virtues, here Augustine is kind of Platonic. The virtues are not something that just exist in us. There are the virtues out there, most developed where they exist in God, right? And in a certain way, by participating in these virtues, we participate in the divine economy, however you want to frame it, right? The mind of God, providence, all these sorts of things. So when we actually have a virtue in ourselves, that virtue is being patterned after something which is virtue per se, right? So he calls these principles and illuminations, so to speak, in which the virtues appear. These are true and unchangeable. So, what about the virtues in us? If we're building these through pruning our will, through using the will to modify itself, through, say, listening to good guidance, adapting ourselves to good models, resisting temptations, picking ourselves up and, making things right after we screw up and give in to these temptations, for temporal goods over eternal goods. We're in process of change. So the virtues in us are not unchanging and eternal. But they are over here. They are in God, or in the mind of God, or in the illuminations that we're being given. So he says, whether separately or altogether, these are present in common to the sight of those who can see them, each with his own reason in mind. So reason is part of what, gets illuminated and grasps these virtues. It's the will that has to endorse them. It's the will that has to take them on and say, yes, I want these. So he's asking about these, and he puts this in terms of wisdom. And a little bit later he says, so it's quite clear that those principles and illuminations, as we've called them, in which the virtues appear, concern wisdom. The more a man uses them in living his life, and the more he passes his life in conformity to them, the more wisely he lives and acts. But nothing which is done wisely can rightly be called distinct from wisdom. So there is wisdom in sort of an eternal sense, and then there's wisdom as we participate in it, which is something that can grow in us, something that can wane in us if we don't practice it, if we don't align ourselves properly with the greater things that transcend us. So the virtues, insofar, like he says, insofar, the more that a man uses them in living his life. So you practice the virtues through the way that you actually live, the way that you choose, the way that you eat, drink, celebrate, the ways that you mourn, the ways that you console other people, the ways that you deal with other people day to day, whether you're a jerk, whether you are a good person, whether you're generous and kind, whether you're cruel, whether you forgive, whether you hold grudges, all these sorts of things. The very fabric of our ordinary life is a locus in which the virtues can be developed according to these illuminations that are provided to anybody who wants to have them, he says. The more that a person passes his life in conformity with them, the more wisdom they acquire. So wisdom for Augustine is not just a matter of sort of intellectual as opposed to practical knowledge. And it's not even going to be something that is devoid of emotion. Let's go on from there. We've already made quite a bit of progress in thinking about this. We come back to thinking about these virtues again. Again, this is in Book 2, and he says, is free will a good? That's one of the preoccupations of Book 2. So he says, let's make a contrast here. Let's think about these virtues. So let's take justice. Take justice, which no one uses wrongly. If you actually have justice, you're not going to screw things up. That's what it means to actually fully possess a virtue. It says, this is counted among the highest goods proper to man, and among all the soul's virtues which go up to make a right and worthy life. No one uses wrongly either prudence or fortitude or temperance. So all these cardinal virtues, we can't go wrong with them according to Augustine. Other moral theorists later on, like Kant or Bentham, will say, courage, for example, can be used for all sorts of terrible things. Augustine is much more, Platonic in this sense. If you actually have courage, courage includes knowledge of what you ought to despise and what you ought to take seriously, what you ought to resist, and you're not going to go wrong with it. So he says, in all of these, right reason reigns, without which no virtues can exist. No one can use right reason wrongly. So the virtues are a kind of good that can't be used wrongly. They are good in themselves, and they're just good. He says, the powers of the soul, so here we're looking at this stuff, without which we cannot live rightly, are the middle goods. No one uses the virtues wrongly, but anyone can use the other goods, the middle and the least, wrongly as well as rightly. No one uses virtue wrongly because, and here's a sort of a definition that Thomas Aquinas will take up, the work of virtue is the good use of those things which we are capable of using wrongly. The work of virtue is to help us to make good use of things. Let's all these kinds of goods which we can go wrong with. With these temporal goods, we can go wrong in how we use them. We can go wrong in how we order them in relation to each other or to the eternal goods. We're not actually going to go wrong in respect to the eternal goods, except insofar as we, maybe subordinate them to temporal goods. The virtues help us to keep from doing that. They help us to make the right orderings when we get into the nitty-gritty of actual decisions. So he says, what about free will? Free will, that's something that we can use wrongly. As a matter of fact, we know that we use it wrongly an awful lot, right? He says, if we use other things by means of free will, we can also use free will itself by means of itself. So we can actually, the will is reflexive. So he says, when the will, which is a middle good, clings to the unchangeable good, not as a private possession, not selfishly, not saying, hey, this is mine, but as common to all in the same way as the truth, then man possesses the happy life. So, truth, wisdom, the life of the virtues, they're all going to be connected with each other. And he goes on and he talks a little bit more about the virtues. He says, nobody is prudent through another's prudence. Nobody's brave through another's bravery. Nobody's temperate through another's temperate. Nor is a man made just through another's justice. But he becomes such by conforming his soul to the unchangeable principles and illuminations of the virtues, which have incorruptible life in truth itself and wisdom, which is common to all. So, when I'm, for example, learning how to be a more temperate person by observing another person who actually is temperate and saying, man, that person's got their life together, I ought to be like them, instead of being uncontrolled, or self-indulgent in this respect, I ought to, do what they do. And then maybe I talk with them and I say, hey, do you think you can help me out? I'm having trouble with, managing my desires with respect to X, Y, Z. And they say, yeah, here's what worked for me. I suggest you do this. Maybe they even say, St. Augustine says, or Aristotle says, or whoever, pick whatever instructor you like. What's really going on is there's some appeal, some directedness that's going on towards these eternal truths that the virtues are part of. Virtues, not just the virtues in us or in another person, but the virtues as archetypical forms, as that which is in certain ways more knowable. So he goes on and he says, the model this man has set up for himself is endowed with these virtues, and he has conformed and attached his soul to these virtues. Now, a lot more could be said about this, but I'm trying to keep this fairly short, so I'm going to try to move through this. Are we, so to speak, either virtuous or totally vicious? Augustine says no. He actually says at one point we need not fear there may be a life halfway between virtue and vice, which might make us a little bit nervous, and we say, oh man, I'm not virtuous, I must be vicious. And there are some places where Augustine talks as if if you don't have the virtue of justice, you're unjust. If you don't have the virtue of temperance, you're intemperate. It's either one or the other. There's no middle ground where you're kind of I'm working on becoming temperate, but I'm not yet temperate, and I'm attracted to intemperance or anything like that. In this work, he actually does address that, and he says there are cases where we're sort of in between. He says, human nature receives a middle state which cannot rightly be called either folly or wisdom. And folly and wisdom, foolishness, wisdom, that has to do with how we're actually directing ourselves. All the virtues themselves are tied in with wisdom. So, like he says, folly is not any kind of ignorance of what we should seek and what we should avoid, but it's vicious ignorance. It's being screwed up. It's not just being ignorant as such. It's like ignorance that you are responsible for, ignorance squared. Ignorance that perpetuates itself, that resists its own amending, you might say. And now, how can this be possible? Well, Augustine says to be rational is different than being wise. We're all rational, right? We all have a faculty of reason, and that faculty of reason can kind of reach out not only into the world, but into within ourselves, even into the divine economy, into God, and look for things and realize things. That's the way reason works for Augustine. That doesn't mean that we use it all the time. So he says, by reason every man is made able. That's a key word, able. Doesn't mean that it actually happens. It made able to recognize the command to which you ought to be faithful, and so to carry out what is commanded. As reason of its very nature makes us recognize the command, so observance of the command makes us gain wisdom. It's not enough just to exercise reason and to get the information that we need. We actually have to choose it, and by choosing it, then we actually start to acquire wisdom as a kind of fruit that can take hold in us, put its roots into our being. So he says, what nature does in making us recognize this command, this the will does in making us observe it. As the rational nature is, in a sense, the merit of receiving the command, so the observance of the command is the merit of receiving wisdom. So that's about what goes right. What about what goes wrong? He says the evil of sin. So what is sin? It's going against these sort of rules that we're getting, and we could figure out if we pay close attention, or consult other people who are smarter than us, what we ought to do. It consists in in neglect either to grasp the command, or to observe it, or to practice the contemplation of wisdom. So something can go wrong with reason, something can go wrong with will, and then it can take root inside of us. So he says, it's clear there's a state between these two by which a man passes from wisdom to folly. Somebody can be wise, and then they can screw it up. Just because you have wisdom once doesn't mean that you're actually going to hold on to it. You have to choose it. You have to keep valuing it as a good over these other temporal goods. An act done in the state cannot be called an act either of folly or wisdom. It says, in the present life, man can only understand this through what contradicts it. For no mortal man becomes wise unless he passes from folly, foolishness, to wisdom. If he makes the passage foolishly, there's stupid understandings of what wisdom consists in, and if you have one of those, you're not going to become wise. It would be absurd to call it a good action. Well, if he makes it wisely, it's also absurd to say he already possessed wisdom before he passed to wisdom. Hence, we see there's a state between the two which can be described in neither way. So it's interesting to see what he's saying here. It's murky. The life that we live in is kind of hard to articulate well exactly where we are, on our way to, do we have these virtues? Are we developing them? Do we at least recognize that these are a good thing? Do we recognize that we need to grow in our understanding of what those are, which would be wisdom, which would be, participating in this truth here? Do we need to use our will on our will more to increase these virtues in ourselves? Are we deficient, highly deficient with respect to them? Those are all good questions, and those are all things that you have to sort of work out on the way. He also talks about corruption and vice, and I'm going to actually go through this fairly quickly. The virtues are goods. They are goods that help us make right use of other goods. They're goods that are to be valued for their own sake. And they're goods that have to do with the goods that the human being possesses in being a human being. Goods can become corrupted, turned to wrong uses. When that happens, a kind of privation is set up. And Augustine makes use of an example which a lot of other thinkers would do. This one goes back all the way to Aristotle. You don't say that a stone is blind and that blindness is actually something wrong with the stone. In a human being who ought to have sight, blindness is a privation of what ought to be there. It's a lack. It's something negative. It's different than simply not having something that you didn't have to have. When it comes to rightly, right use of reason, even the passions and desires, the right ordering, and especially the right ordering of the will, there's a way or ways in which we ought to be. And insofar as we aren't measuring up to that, we have a lack within ourselves. A lot of people talk about this in terms of brokenness or being damaged or things like that. And I think that makes good sense from an Augustinian perspective. But it's also ontological. There is a corruption, a lack within us. And so he talks about this as vice. A vice is actually a corruption of the human being. It says vice is only evil because it's opposed to the nature of the thing which has the vice. So when we are not prudent, when we're stupid, pig-headed, when we refuse to look at what's actually good for us, when we tell ourselves lies about what is actually to our advantage or our benefit, we're damaging our being. We're not only deviating from this, we're damaging ourselves inside, in our will, and it's not something that you can just get rid of immediately. It takes root. It becomes a habit. It becomes what we call a vice, right? Fortitude. If you can't resist, and he's not thinking so much about battlefield courage or something like that. If you are so afraid of what people think of you that you start making all sorts of stupid decisions that are the wrong thing to do, or if you want money so badly that you'll sell anybody out to get it, that's a lack of fortitude. Not just a lack of prudence, that's a lack of fortitude on your part, Augustine would say. And what is the effect of this? Well, like he says, a man who knows what he ought to do, this is in Book 3, and does not do it loses the knowledge of what is right, and the man who has refused to act rightly when he could loses the power when he wishes to have it. These things have effects on us. That's why when we actually have some modicum of these virtues, we got to stick with them and keep on building the little reserve that we have. Because again, if we don't use it, we lose it. And if we lose it, we cut ourselves off from this stuff over here, which we need. So I'm actually going to end with talking about this great passage in Book 1 that I love, in part because it reflects another passage in Anselm. He says, "Surely that punishment should not be thought a light one which consists in the mind being ruled by a passion, being robbed of its store of virtue, being dragged hither and thither, poor and needy, now judging false for true, now defending, now attacking what before it approved, and in spite of this running off into fresh falsehood, now withholding its assent, and often frightened of clear reasoning, now despairing of finding any truth at all, and clinging closely to the darkness of its folly, now striving for the light of understanding, and again falling back through exhaustion. Meanwhile, the passions rage like tyrants and throw into confusion the whole soul and life of men with storms from every quarter. Fear on one side, desire on another anxiety or false empty joy. Here pain for the thing which was loved and lost, there eagerness to win what is not possessed, there grief for an injury received, here burning desire to avenge it. Wherever he turns, avarice can confine him, self-indulgence dissipate him, ambition master him, pride puff him up, envy torture him, sloth drug him, obstinacy rouse him, oppression afflict him, and countless other feelings which crowd and exploit the power of passion. Can we think this no punishment at all? Which, as you see, all who do not cling to wisdom must necessarily suffer. What Augustine is saying is if we don't cultivate these virtues, or if we even misunderstand the nature of these virtues, and we think that there's something that we can possess as our own individual possession forevermore, and we don't align ourselves with the eternal truths that the virtues are bound up with, if we don't subject ourselves to that, put in very short terms, we're screwed. Our intellect is damaged, unable to accomplish what it ought to do. The passions go out of control. The will, even when it wants to do the right thing, finds itself unable to carry it through. Doesn't mean that you become a terrible person or something like that. Bad people, a lot of the time, have a lot of goodness in them. It's just that the bad stuff ends up overshadowing that because it ends up turning everything and twisting everything. And like he says, if you don't choose the virtues, pretty soon you're choosing the vices, and they will take hold whether you like it or not. And then once they've got a hold of you, they run you until you use your will, hopefully aided by something else, to start building things back up again. It's almost like, Augustine is talking about 12 steps, several, 1,000 and several hundred years before anybody ever came up with it. He's discussing the same sort of thing. So, hopefully that helped you understand what the virtues are, what's going on with all this virtue and vice talk on free choice of the will. Like I said, it's not an entire theory of it. It's more sort of vignettes of what Augustine will develop more clearly and more articulately in other works.